Students, you are most welcome in our previous year papers analysis series. And today I will discuss this economics optional second paper 2016 questions asking in 20 marks. And you have to write 200 words on these questions. Question seems very simple, but when you reach its exact sense, you will feel that this is the healthy questions where you have to write a number of things. First, you listen the questions carefully and understand the meaning of these questions. Critically examine the difference between absolute poverty and relative poverty. Between the two, which is more appropriate? Give reasons. Actually, this question is based on three questions. First, the relative and absolute poverty differences critically examine means you have to give what are the positive, what are the negative of both the methods of poverty estimates, that is absolute poverty and relative poverty. Second point which you have to discuss, that is more important, between the two which is more appropriate. You have to justify which method is more appropriate, and for that you have to give the reason. Now you are clear. If you go through this key point, means what is the key point? That is absolute poverty, relative poverty, differences, and critically examine. After then you have to give in which is best or which is appropriate method. It is appropriate method, it is absolute poverty or relative poverty, and why. You have to give the reasons for the explanation of this complete question. Now you are clear about the key point. By taking this one, you can start your answer within 20 words limit, because you have to write down the questions only in 200 words. That is the point which you have to focus in this question. You know, students, what is the meaning of absolute poverty and what is the meaning of relative poverty? First of all, you have to clear about that. Absolute poverty means basic minimum need of life, that is shelter, clothes, food, transportation means, mobile for social interaction. These are the latest components of absolute poverty. If they are getting that one, means they are out of the absolute poverty, and on the basis of this one they define the poverty line. As you know, recently in 2025 World Bank defined the poverty line $3 per capita per day. That is the poverty line defined by the World Bank. Similarly, in India, different experts giving the different poverty line estimates. You know that. What is the relative poverty? Actually, relative poverty based on median income of the country. Suppose median income 50% people of the country say 10,000 rupees. If a person is getting say 9,000 rupees per month, he will be known as relatively poor. It means relative definition of poverty include the basic minimum standard of life, and that shows the disparity in the distribution of wealth, income, consumption, etc. It means relative definition of poverty measure the inequality and social exclusion and inclusion, both you can measure that one, and absolute poverty line definition measure the what, that is basic minimum need of life. This is the definition. Now you have to focus the two things, where the focus of absolute poverty and where the focus of relative poverty. As in my definition I clear that point. If they are physically survival and basic needs, they are known as above the poverty line, and this is measured by the absolute poverty. In case of relative poverty, income inequality and social inclusion measured by relative poverty. That is the focus point of relative poverty. What is the threshold type? Threshold type means if you take the time period, there is no change in the threshold limit of the absolute poverty line. Only the poverty line definition can be changed, but threshold limit remaining the poverty line. But in case of relative poverty, this threshold limit change day by day, year by year, month by month, because relative median income of the society will change, and similarly relative poverty also change. What is the standard measure? As I defined you recently, World Bank using $3 per capita per day per month for the measurement of absolute poverty. In case of relative poverty, as I told you, median income, say 50% median income of a country is the base for defining the relative poverty. And now the question second, now you are critically examining what are the limitations of absolute poverty and what are the limitations of relative poverty. You know, this is not measure the absolute poverty and this is not measure the relative poverty. These are the limitations of these kinds of poverty. Now the second point which you have to know about that one, that is the which is more appropriate and give the reasons. Actually, which poverty definition used by a particular country depends on that. Generally, developing country use the absolute poverty line or absolute poverty definition. Developed country use the relative poverty. Why it is so? As you know, developing countries facing the different kinds of problem and their main thrust of policy, main thrust of government to uplift the vulnerable section of the society who are not getting minimum basic needs of life. That is why the absolute definition of poverty is better for those countries. Policy always formulate on the basis of this absolute poverty. That is why absolute poverty is better in case of developing country. And relative poverty beyond the survival and tracking inequality. Both the thing is necessity of the developed country. But I again say it depends on the government vision and policy which kinds of poverty line they will use. As you can see, in case of India, NITI Aayog using multi-dimensional poverty index, which is including both absolute poverty as well as relative poverty, means we like to provide the vulnerable sections the basic minimum need, as well as we like to minimize the inequality among the society on the basis of assets, income, consumption, etc., so that we can achieve the desired target of our economic policy, inclusive development, faster and more sustainable. That is why you can conclude these questions that which is appropriate depends on the nation's policy and target of the government. Now you are very clear, student. You will further see me in next expected questions. This is the previous year questions on economics optional. I would like to suggest that you can opt economics as an optional, very good subject. In second paper, you already have to prepare yourself for general study third paper. And if you prepare it, the first paper is highly scoring, highly mark given. And if you are clear in first paper of economics, you automatically do better in comparison to other students the second paper of economics also. That is why I suggest you have to update your knowledge, current updates. And as you can see in second paper of general study or other paper, you also find some questions based on economic knowledge and which you will enhance by the opting economics optional, and it also contribute you in your general study as well as your essay paper and interview paper. Thank you, student. For today, I will meet again with the new questions, previous year as well as expected questions in next session.